All right, so you sent this over, this article about this huge development they're proposing in Great Nicobar Island.
Yeah.
And it feels like one of those stories where it's like progress, but also like at what cost? Right?
Yeah, exactly. And the potential consequences for indigenous communities and the environment. I mean,
Yeah,
just looking at it from a, like a 30,000-foot view, even before we get into the article itself, like
Yeah.
what does that actually look like on the ground
Yeah,
for the people who actually live there?
for sure. For sure. Well, and that's what I think is so interesting about this Article 14 piece,
Yeah.
featuring Justin Anstice.
Yeah, he seems like someone who's really, what they're talking about.
Yeah.
Because he's coming at this as a Nicobarese anthropologist, but also a former government official, so.
So he's got that inside-outside perspective,
Exactly.
which is really fascinating.
Yeah.
But I think before we even really unpack his argument, I think it'd be helpful just to kind of set the stage for folks who may not be familiar with Great Nicobar.
Yeah, definitely.
What are we talking about when we talk about this island? What's there?
So picture this, right? Like pristine rainforests.
Okay.
Like a haven for unique species you're not going to find anywhere else.
Right.
Home to the Shompen and Nicobarese tribes.
Okay.
These are indigenous communities that have lived in harmony with this environment for centuries.
Wow.
And they have like this deep spiritual connection to the land.
So you've got this ancient ecosystem kind of flourishing.
Totally. And we're talking like old growth forests here.
Right.
Like some of these trees have been around for like centuries.
Yeah.
And now imagine like just the sheer scale of what they're proposing to introduce.
Right.
A deep water court.
Okay.
An international airport resorts, even a whole new town.
So this isn't just like adding a few amenities. This is like transforming the whole island.
This is like taking what was essentially like a pristine ecosystem and trying to turn it into like a bustling hub of commerce and tourism.
Yeah.
And the article mentions a budget of over 72,000 crore rupees.
Which translates to...
It's like $9 billion US.
Yeah, close to $9 billion US.
It's a lot of money.
It's massive.
Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously, when we're talking about a project of that scale...
The environmental consequences are kind of impossible to ignore.
Absolutely.
What are we talking about here? What?
I mean, just to give you one staggering statistic.
Right.
They're talking about potentially losing nearly 1 million trees.
1 million trees.
1 million trees.
That's incredible.
And we're not just talking about like individual trees here, right?
Right, it's an entire ecosystem.
We're talking about an entire ecosystem that's developed over centuries.
And this is where I think Anstice's perspective as an anthropologist is so valuable.
Oh, totally.
Because he's able to kind of talk about how the Shompen in particular, who are this semi-nomadic tribe who have this very deep connection to the forest.
Yeah.
He describes it as, they don't just view it as a resource, they view it as like a living library.
Yeah, like every plant, every animal, every aspect of that forest holds significance for them.
Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, what does that actually look like in practice?
Yeah, so there's this one anecdote that Anstice shares that I found really powerful.
Okay.
He was being guided through the forest by some Shompen, and he instinctively like reached out to cut a small branch.
Yeah.
Just to mark their path, like we do.
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
And they gently stopped him.
Oh, wow.
Because for them, even that small act of cutting a branch is like disrupting this delicate balance that they have so much reverence for.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good reminder that development, even when it's coming from a place of, good intentions, doesn't always translate into an improvement for everyone, especially when we're talking about indigenous communities.
And that brings us to, I think, a crucial part of this whole story, which is the impact on both the Shompen and the Nicobarese people.
Right.
Because they are the ones who are going to be most affected by this project.
So let's start with the Shompen.
Okay.
Because they're particularly vulnerable. I mean,
they really are.
Given their semi-nomadic lifestyle.
Yeah, and their unique language, which very few people outside of their community actually speak.
I mean, and that raises the question of, like, can you even have true informed consent?
It's a huge issue.
When you're dealing with a language barrier of that magnitude.
Exactly, because how do you explain the intricacies of a multi-billion-dollar development project and all of its potential consequences to a community whose entire language and worldview is just fundamentally different from your own.
Yeah, it's a huge question. Like, how do you
Yeah.
even begin to bridge that divide?
Yeah, and it's something that Anstice grapples with throughout the article,
Right.
and particularly as he recounts the Nicobarese experience as well.
And they're in a different situation.
They are.
I mean, they've had more interaction with the outside world.
Yeah, they have. They're not as isolated as the Shompen.
But their story also reveals this real sense of, like, broken trust. And we're not even talking about, like, ancient history here.
Yeah, not at all.
The Nicobarese are still dealing with the aftermath of the 2004 tsunami.
Oh, absolutely. That was devastating for them.
And many of them are still living in temporary shelters
I know. It's heartbreaking.
that have become sadly kind of more permanent than intended.
It's like they're stuck in this limbo of trying to rebuild their lives after this catastrophe.
Right. Yeah, and then this project emerges, right?
Yeah, it's almost like adding insult to injury.
It really is.
They're trying to rebuild their lives.
Right.
And then you have this project potentially threatening their ancestral lands.
Totally.
Their way of life.
Yeah, Anstice even mentions allegations of, signatures being rushed for this project.
Right.
Like meetings being held without adequate information.
Yeah, where people didn't really understand what they were signing or what the implications were going to be.
Right, and it kind of gets at this disconnect that Anstice keeps highlighting, right?
Totally.
Which is that the government's vision of development doesn't seem to line up with what the Nicobarese actually need or are concerned about.
Yeah, and he points to the healthcare system as a prime example.
What's the situation there? Because I imagine, like, access to health care on these islands is got to be essential.
It's crucial.
Given how isolated they are.
Absolutely, but what Anstice describes is really disheartening.
Okay.
Inadequate facilities,
Right.
a lack of specialists.
Okay.
He even mentions a dialysis unit
Okay.
that was installed, but it's just sitting there unused because there's no technician to operate it.
Wow. So they have this, like, potentially life-saving equipment.
Yeah.
Just gathering dust.
It's a metaphor for this whole thing.
It really is.
Like grand gestures, but no follow through.
Yeah, it really highlights that gap between, like, what's on paper
Yeah.
and then what actually happens.
And I think it speaks to this larger issue of this
Yeah.
top-down approach to development that we often see.
Where it's like decisions being made.
In some far-off capital by
Yeah.
people who've probably never even set foot on these islands.
Totally, and have no understanding of what life is actually like there.
Exactly. So Anstice is really advocating for this more inclusive model, right?
Okay, so how do we do that? How do we, like, shift the narrative here?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right, because, I mean, how do we make sure that development, particularly in a place as unique and fragile as Great Nicobar, is actually beneficial?
Right.
And doesn't end up harming the people who call it home?
Well, I think Anstice would say we need to start by listening to the people who live there, like actually listening.
And what are they saying?
They're saying we need basic necessities.
Okay.
Reliable transportation,
Okay.
quality education, access to healthcare.
These are not, like, radical ideas.
They're not.
These are, like, the foundations of a functioning society.
Exactly. And yet, these are the things that they're still struggling to attain.
It's a good reminder that, like, progress shouldn't come at the cost of people's well-being.
Exactly.
Or their cultural identity.
Yeah.
And speaking of cultural identity, I kind of want to circle back to the Shompen for a minute. Because we talked about their deep reverence for the forest.
Right. Like, they see it as this living library.
Right. And that just seems like such a stark contrast to
Yeah, it's heartbreaking.
the potential impact of this project.
Like, you have this ancient tribe
Right.
who views the forest as sacred. And now you have this project that could completely destroy it.
Yeah, like Anstice was talking about how they can identify, like, the medicinal properties of plants.
Oh, yeah. They have this incredible knowledge
Right.
passed down through generations.
And that story he told about them stopping him from cutting that branch.
Yeah, it's such a small gesture.
Right.
But it speaks volumes.
About their entire worldview and their relationship to nature.
Totally. And it makes you realize just how much is at stake here.
Right, because it's not just about protecting trees.
No.
It's about protecting an entire way of life.
Absolutely. It's about preserving cultural heritage.
And I think that's something that often gets lost in these conversations about development.
It's all about the bottom line.
Right.
But we forget about the human cost.
Yeah, and I think that's why Anstice's perspective is so valuable here.
He brings that human element to the forefront.
Right, because he has that lived experience of being Nicobarese.
And having worked within the government.
Right, so he's kind of able to bridge these two worlds.
He gets it.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And he doesn't shy away from calling out the flaws in the system either.
No, he's very critical of the government's handling of this.
Like, he points out that the Nicobarese Tribal Council repeatedly voiced their concerns.
Yeah, they tried to engage in dialogue,
Right.
but they were met with silence.
They were ignored.
Basically, which I think speaks to this.
Like power imbalance.
Deeply concerning power imbalance.
And this isn't just a Great Nicobar thing, right?
No, this is a global issue.
This is like
Indigenous communities all over the world facing the same struggle.
being sidelined.
Their voices silenced.
In the name of progress.
It's a pattern we see again and again.
So the question is, what does responsible development look like?
Yeah, what's the alternative?
Especially when we're talking about engaging with communities who have such a different relationship with the land.
Right.
And a different vision of what progress means.
It's a fundamental question we need to be asking ourselves.
Yeah, it feels like we're at this crossroads, right?
Right.
Where the old way of doing things just isn't working.
It's not sustainable.
Right.
And it's definitely not equitable.
And what's so interesting is that, Anstice isn't saying, like, no development.
Right.
He's not saying, like,
let's just keep things exactly as they are.
Right. He's not saying, like, let's just freeze time.
No.
He's pushing for, like, a different understanding of what that word even means.
Exactly. Like, what does development really mean?
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about indigenous communities.
Right.
Who have this totally different relationship with the land.
Okay, so, like, if we were to actually try to do this differently and take what we're learning from this situation in Great Nicobar,
Yeah.
what would that look like?
Yeah.
What would genuine ethical development actually entail?
Well, I think it starts with a shift in perspective.
Right.
Instead of seeing indigenous communities as obstacles to development,
Right.
we need to see them as partners.
Partners.
Yeah, because they have so much to offer.
Like what?
Their knowledge, their values,
Right.
their understanding of these ecosystems
Yeah, we don't have.
that we often overlook.
Yeah.
So it's about tapping into that wisdom.
So instead of this top-down approach, which is what we were talking about before.
Yeah, decisions made in some far-off office.
Wow.
It's about bringing people to the table.
Right, so like a more collaborative model.
Collaboration is key.
Okay.
And that means actually listening
Okay.
to what these communities are saying.
And making sure they understand.
Exactly.
Like, what are the potential consequences here?
Not just like, here's some money.
Right.
But like, what does this mean for your land?
Right.
What does this mean for your culture?
What does it mean for your future?
Your way of life, your children, your grandchildren.
And that requires a level of, like, sensitivity that I think has been missing.
It's about approaching these situations with humility.
Humility.
Yeah, because we don't have all the answers.
Right.
And often the communities we're trying to help.
Actually have a lot to teach us.
Exactly. They hold wisdom that we can learn from.
And it makes me think about, what Anstice was saying about the Shompen and their knowledge of the environment.
Right. They have this deep understanding.
Right, that's been passed down through generations.
It's invaluable.
Right, and we could be learning so much.
If we just take the time to listen.
So it's not about extracting information.
No.
It's about, like, a reciprocal relationship.
Exactly.
A partnership.
Where we're both benefiting.
Mutual respect, mutual understanding.
It's about recognizing that we're all connected.
Totally.
Right? What happens in one part of the world,
Affects us all.
whether it's a tiny island,
Or a big city.
we're all part of this one planet.
And as we're facing these huge challenges.
Right, like climate change.
Biodiversity loss.
We need to find a better way forward. We can't keep doing things the way we've always done them.
And I think what Anstice is arguing for is a more sustainable path.
Absolutely.
One that respects indigenous knowledge, cultural heritage,
Yeah,
and the natural world.
because ultimately that's the only way we're going to create a future.
Right. Where everyone can thrive.
Exactly.
Not just some of us.
Everyone.
It's not just about building more stuff.
Yeah.
It's about building a better future.
A more just future.
For everyone.
And for the planet.
It's a good reminder
It is.
that progress isn't just about, like, bigger, faster, more efficient.
It's about doing things differently.
It's about doing things the right way.
And it's about listening to the voices that have been silenced for too long.
Well said.
Thank you.
It's been great talking to you about this.
It's been a pleasure.
I always learn so much from these conversations.
Me too.
And I hope our listeners do too.
I hope so too.
So for everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
And until next time, keep asking those tough questions.
Stay curious.